Greetings, everyone. My name is Shamaya Lodge, and I am speaking from the United States. I'm so excited to be here today with all of you for our second main session this week. As a reminder, it is Global Entrepreneur Week 2025, brought to you by the League of Entrepreneurs. In today's session, we'll really focus on if the earth had a seat in the boardroom. And so today I have a few of my colleagues here. We will center the conversation on that very topic. Before we kick off, again, my name is Shamaya Lodge, and I am the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for a technology company right here in the United States of America. And so to get things kicked off today, when we think about a boardroom, we often picture a group of executives around a polished table making major decisions. But the boardroom itself isn't just a place, it's the setting where governance, accountability, and long term vision come together. Inside that room sits the board of directors, the people legally responsible for guiding the organization's direction. Their primary role is to hire and, when necessary, remove the CEO who reports directly to them. The board also approves budgets, oversees risk, ensure ethical and legal compliance, and safeguards the company's mission and reputation. In many ways, the boardroom becomes both the compass and conscience of the company, where purpose meets power. We'll hear a little bit more in a few on different versions of really how board of directors show up in many different organizations. Now, for a second, imagine if that compass included the earth itself. If our planet, yes, our planet, had a voice in the boardroom, a seat at the table, how might our decisions change? What will shift if every policy, product, or investment had to serve the well being of life itself? Right now, you'll hear from my colleagues who, before they answer this question I'm going to ask, they'll introduce themselves, they'll tell you where they're located in this world, and we'll start to dialogue on this very topic. So let's begin. If the earth had a voice in the boardroom today, what will it be saying to your organization? We'll kick things off with Alexis.
Yeah, I'm calling in from Munich, Germany, though you can hear an American accent here. I was originally born in the States. I've been in Germany since 2007. Right, short background. So I have spent most of my career, about 20 plus years, mostly in large corporates up until now, leading sustainability in places like Adidas and in engineering firms like Arcadis. But now my job is actually to be the managing director of EU and UK market development for Sublime Systems, which is actually a startup scale up which is making ultra low carbon cement. So basically making a material that no longer has carbon in it. Okay, so back to the questions. One of the things, I've actually chaired several board committees, and when I talk to folks who are outside of the corporate space or perhaps haven't been in the boardroom themselves, there's usually a misconception about what happens in the boardroom and even what it does. So, as you were saying, their job is to hire and fire the CEO. That is the one action real power that they have. They also have accountability, legal accountability for knowing that things have been, there's good governance and disclosure for the company. But their real power comes from the questions that they ask because actually their role is to advise and consent. That means they help the company develop strategy, mostly through the kinds of pointed questions that they ask. Have you looked into this enough? What is your plan for that? And the company is accountable to them to answer those questions. That said, they are not the executive committee. They don't take the decisions of we're going to go do this, we're going to implement this policy, and often they don't get down into the details. So I think the role that usually it winds up having is a very strategic one. It's as somebody who looks after the health of the company and the welfare of the people in it and the welfare of the long-term survival of this company, they actually have to say, okay, what strategy have you put in place? Have you seen all the angles? Have you planned for where competitors are growing? Have you, you know, seen new markets opening up? And are you ready for market changes? And in that place right now, people used to say you would have a sustainability strategy and a growth or a company strategy. Right now, considering how much climate change is affecting everything from prices within companies to products that are on offer to opportunities to enter or leave markets, basically, right now, your sustainability strategy is your company's strategy if you've done it right. And that means not just focusing on very specific and narrow ESG topics, but how does it infuse everything in the company's strategy overall?
That's really, really, really great. Thank you so much, Alexis. Paul, what are your thoughts when you think about if the earth had a voice in the boardroom today, what might it be telling your organization? Please introduce yourself.
I'm Paul Chatterton, beaming in from Vienna, Austria. So I lead an organization called the Landscape Finance Lab. With the help of the League, we span out of the conservation organization WWF 4 years ago, and our purpose is to help people structure landscape solutions and get large finance into large landscapes for long-term change. So how do we get the nature into the boardrooms? Well, nature and business are antithetical at the moment. It's business that's destroying nature. Let's be really clear about this. And the consequences we have is a polycrisis, the crisis of climate, the crisis of biodiversity, of water. Governance, it comes back in some ways to the crisis of governance we're seeing comes back to nature and so on. And food supply chains are getting more and more fragile. I think we need to be aware of that. That's not affecting many businesses yet, but it will. All businesses will be affected by supply chain volatility, by resource access, there'll be stranded assets. We'll see more zoonotic diseases for sure. It's not pretty. How do we solve that? Well, I think there's two ways. We can put nature in the boardroom, and the Maori people of New Zealand have done the most exciting work there. The Wanganui River has its own legal presence. It is a person in law represented in decision making. The river itself, and a human being obviously represents the river in decision making structures. That's the most radical way. But businesses can, if they're not willing to take that level of action, you can join the TNFD, you can look at the nature risk in your supply chain, you can start looking at nature positive. What can you do positively? But I think the really exciting thing, and this is what we're working on, is creating boardrooms for nature. The resources that come from nature are really are what run our economy. So can we create landscape investment programs where nature is at the center of the story, where the people in those landscapes make the decisions with nature, for nature, for their communities, and that shifts the economy. I think that's what we're working on. And we've just put out a report recently called Investing in Critical Systems. Is really only for critical systems that we have to prioritize. Rainforest reefs and wetlands contain most of the biodiversity on the planet, and they cover only 10% of the land on this planet, land and sea area.
Mhm.
Let's start with them. And agriculture is the fourth system. It's destroying those first three. So we need to transform the agriculture, but it's where our food comes from. So we've got a very strong incentive to do that.
Mhm.
Shemaya.
No, that's really, really, really good. And I do want to circle back on the report that you issued, really around some of the data points. But we'll circle back on that. I want to tap on Marjorie right now, and given your experience and some of the work you've done from a nature perspective, would really love your opinion and perspective on what Paul really just said, like centering the folks who are closest to the problem, really solving for the solution. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so hello everyone. It's great to be here with back in the league's warm embrace. My name is Marjorie Brands, and I'm based in Toronto. And I started out in the humanitarian sector and social sector, but it was Hurricane Katrina that really convinced me that we can't sustain that level of catastrophe on a regular basis. So I started working at the intersection of climate change adaptation and the private sector around that time. And I worked on everything from shareholder activism to being the counterpart for people like Alexis when I was at Oxfam's private sector team. I worked on looking at lending policies, looking at corporate reports and their metrics, on and on. Eventually, I started doing more of my own projects, trying to remove landmines from agricultural land. And over time, really started to realize that we don't have a poly crisis. We have a meta crisis. It is not a bunch of different crises. It is actually one crisis with a single root cause. And so I think it's important to talk about that meta crisis and to realize that we humans have it all wrong. We have the idea that nature needs to be at the corporate table in the boardroom. But in fact, it is the corporations that are at nature's table. She has set the table, and we are destroying the table that feeds us. So my belief is that, to move into sustainability, we need to get away from a lot of our micro ESG wins, which are wonderful. It's all great, but they are not adding up to actual change in the dynamics of the system. There is a concept in complexity theory called the feedback dominance theorem, which essentially just means that if you keep doing the same things, you're going to get the same result. We may do things that slow it down, but if fundamentally we don't change the dynamics, we're going to continue to get a crash. And I would love to see corporate governance move toward understanding those system level issues and moving towards what Paul talked about, boards that are actually nature defined boards, and all these other boards feed into a single board or unitary boards around particular ecosystems, and they can get to like really concrete visionary change around infrastructure, materials use, energy use, and so on. And then I think we'll actually see changes in the dynamics.
That is really, really, really good. I have a thought, but I'm going to come to Alexis in a minute to maybe help us unpack that thought. Jojo, I'm going to come to you, and I want you to answer the question slightly differently, giving your background and expertise, and you'll introduce yourself in a moment. But if you can also look at this question from the lens of what does given legal personhood to nature means, and how the movement to make ecocide a legal crime is, progressing globally, and how it ties back to really what Paul was saying, like nature, we really have to create boardrooms around nature itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Jojo Mate. I'm co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International. We're an organization that works globally to move forward legislation to recognize the crime of ecocide. In other words, to make it a crime to create severe, widespread, long-term harm to nature. So we're working in the legal space, and that's the kind of perspective that I bring to all of this. And your question, Shemaya, talks about effectively what we think of as the rights of nature. Potentially giving, as Paul was talking about, giving particular landscape features, rights or personhood, giving them effectively, therefore, a sort of a voice in court. There are a number of ways that that's progressed around the world, mostly focusing on particular sort of features of landscapes. But of course, what that speaks to is a much broader shift of the legal system to recognise sort of intrinsic value and intrinsic rights to the living world. What we work on specifically is a little bit different, but highly complementary, which is that we work on the criminal law side. And it is interesting that I noticed when the conversation opened, the graphic said the earth is the boardroom, and then it talked about having the earth in the boardroom, and there's actually sort of, in a sense, two different things, but we've already covered sort of in a way different aspects of that. And interestingly, I mean, we are actually at the moment expanding our directorial board to have a representative of the earth in the boardroom, and then there is a whole sort of movement called Nature on the Board, where people are doing this, and corporations are also doing this. Obviously, we're doing it from the NGO perspective, but I think also one of the aspects the legal side can bring into the boardroom, if you like, is literally bringing that sort of reality check as to what's actually happening, that Marjorie just described as a kind of meta crisis, if you like, because I think I'd just like to just briefly outline why criminal law is important in this regard, because obviously there's environmental regulations all around the world. I mean, they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but on the whole, as we can see, they are failing to prevent mass degradation of nature, failing to prevent the worst excesses of climate crisis, all of these things. And part of the reason for that is there's no real moral stigma attached to breaching regulation. Companies, particularly, larger corporations that perhaps don't really care so much, can potentially afford, if you like, to write the costs of, the cost of exceeding toxin limits or, damaging ecosystems and communities into their balance sheets, and continue making profit as they always do. When we bring the criminal aspect into that, we have a very different level of deterrence. If you're at a C-suite level, or potentially a board of directors level, if this crime is aimed at those in positions of superior responsibility, so you are going to pause with your pen over the dotted line, and actually think to yourself, am I going to be, is this project going to be creating severe widespread and long-term harm? And if so, what do we need to do about that? And it's actually very important that this crime is actually framed in a way that's very intuitively understandable. I mean, if you think about, murder isn't a crime because of how you kill somebody, it's a crime because they end up dead. And so the idea with ecocide law is to have a similar thing with a destruction of the environment. It's not about demonizing particular activities. It's about saying, whatever you do, whatever sector you're in, you should not be creating this level of harm. But until we actually put that guardrail in place, it's ever so tempting for business as usual to continue. So it kind of, it puts that kind of reality check in place that actually connects the decisions people are making with the actual effects that are happening on the ground. And that, I think, is one of the primary things. And just because you asked very briefly, this may sound like a nice idea, but it's well beyond the stage of being a nice idea. There are actually well over 20 governments, parliaments, where bills are being put forward in national jurisdictions. There are also regional agreements already in place, for example, in the EU, and just recently also in Africa, in terms of taking this conversation seriously. The EU has actually already legislated to prevent certain aspects of what they're calling harm comparable to ecocide. And there's even a proposal at the International Criminal Court right now that's on the table to add ecocide to the list of international crimes. So, and all of this has happened within the last sort of 5 or 6 years. So it is an initiative that is moving very fast. And one of the few things that's really kind of cutting through in a very, geopolitically polarized world at the moment. So I hope that's at least some measure of encouragement.
Absolutely. And it's quite fascinating that it's picking up so quick. And I would say quick because it typically takes a long time for policy to pass. And so the fact that it's only been, I heard you say 5 to 7 years, like that's remarkable. And so Alexis, I have a question for you because Jojo brings up some great points. When you think about the boardroom in and of itself and your expertise around it and its structure and all of the many things, what misconception currently do you think people typically have about how the environmental concerns really actually are addressed at the boardroom level? Like, is it really people are saying, there's no room for that. All right, for lack of a better term, when you think about a corporate setting, or are they embracing it, saying, no, now is the time and here is why from a sustainability perspective?
But it always depends on which boardroom you're in. That said, but I would say, in my experience, in the ones I've been in, and in amongst my larger network, all the ones that they've seen, it is rarely a circumstance of, plotting and ignoring completely of the problem. It's actually, in many ways, a complexity challenge and a conflicting incentives challenge, where they are tasked with multiple objectives they need to achieve. And kind of like Jojo was just describing, for better or for worse, those other ones come with higher consequences at the moment. And even I want to put it in a way that people understand that it's not just about profit necessarily. I had a fantastic conversation at one point with a board member, and there was something that it was how quickly we were going to pivot the business in terms of building up a certain side of the business that was much more in favor of the sort of energy transition, green transition, versus winding down another part of the business that was kind of on the edge, and what their comment is, I can see the pace potentially that's necessary to be dynamic and even to compete. I can see the strategy. I see all those things. I also have a responsibility for all of the people within this company and the clients that we serve. Like, if we disappear this overnight, there's plenty of people who don't have jobs. We're going to be shutting down certain towns. And that's actually a true moral concern. They're caring for people. So the incentives are out of whack, and that's usually what's happening. It is also true that because of the complexity of things, usually you've got so many fires burning at the same time that sometimes it is very hard to either step out and step above, or give precedence to something that is a step above, because this fire is burning right now and it could tank the company. So these are totally conflicting directions. I want to say one last thing, though, that kind of picked on, like, connected into something that Marjorie was saying and Jojo was saying, and it may be a bit contrarian, which is one thing that has worked really well in certain boardrooms that I've said in the past. People always expected me to come in, because my title was CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer, to come in and be the person who hugged trees and kissed bunnies. And that was like what my job was to do. So they always expected me to negotiate for a specific thing, to push a certain line, to, in a sense, be the moral compass for them in the boardroom. And actually, one of the things that sometimes I would say is, the earth really doesn't care. They don't care what decision you're going to make. The planet's going to be just fine. It's us who are going to be, excuse me. But, like, really, it
Yeah.
was actually that these collapsing ecosystems, something else will evolve. There will be, and it'll be tragic that we will have lost what we have lost, but it will be our loss, not the planet's loss. So
Mhm.
I think this flip, in terms of, like, us needing to be moral saints and take care of nature, in some ways, just to flip it around and to be able to say, actually, we're fighting for our own survival in this, not in terms of, not getting overly dramatic that all life on Earth will cease, but rather from the perspective of, you're not realizing how fast the environment is changing, which will change the economic environment, which will change who the winners are, which will change the geopolitical situation, which will mean you're out of business. And
Yeah.
then I would start spouting off numbers that everybody was kind of out of date on. They were always assuming things they were giving numbers that were 10 years out of date. And so I said,
Right.
did you know that the markets are here? It's kind of the experience that most people are having these days when they take a plane to Shanghai and they assume China is a certain way, and then they see electric vehicles, batteries, renewable power, and them on the technological cutting edge, and that's a geopolitical advantage. So that was usually the tactic that kind of worked best.
Perception over reality. I love it. This is really good. And I want to come back to Paul because you've mentioned some great points, Alexis. And then I'm trying to think about from a practical perspective, like how can we like absolutely be strategic and so matter of fact about some of these issues from a non-negotiable perspective. And so Paul, going back to your phenomenal report you pulled together, right? How do you ensure those critical areas have representation always, right? So you heard from Alexis, and she said, listen, I will come with the data and I will let the data tell the story. And we have to lean in because the results are there. Like, how do you ensure we kind of lead into the conversations from a non negotiable perspective?
Yeah, the problem we have is that the finance and business system is built around short-term returns and project-based solutions. And nature works at the scale of 1 million hectares and above, in migration systems, corridors, pollination systems, all of those things. We're breaking it apart. And we've got to, if we want to put it back together, we've got to be thinking at that scale, that integrated scale. So building landscapes, having communities build landscapes is the solution. And it can be done all over the world. We're seeing it starting to happen. But it does need incentives for longer term investment, and that's where it requires a combination of community, government, and business all working together. You would think that the carbon world is very useful for the carbon investment world is very useful for nature. Not necessarily, and it can sometimes be quite destructive for communities. We've seen projects where nature is destroyed for carbon outcomes. We've been working in the very northeast of Scotland, helping people restore peatlands at a much larger scale than they've been able to do before. And what we discovered was all of these little carbon projects are actually only done by the rich people in the landscape. You've got to have money to be able to invest to make money out of carbon. It was only that the bigger states that could afford to do that. And everyone else, the farmers and the crofters, were missing out. So we helped them build a coherent program covering 400,000 hectares. This one area in Scotland contains twice as much carbon as all of the forests and woodlands of the UK combined. And they did it together. And they've now increased the speed of restoration dramatically. All of the players are benefiting, but they made an agreement that the smallest players, the crofters and the farmers, would get the first bite of the cherry, that they would get the first profits. And they also made a decision that 10% of those profits would be used to support the community who don't own land. So they're spreading the benefits out. So that's benefiting the community, but it's also having everyone start to think. That gives everyone the opportunity to think about the long term, about the young people in the landscape, the jobs that are possible, the training systems, and so on. And it's been quite transformational. They've picked on the word resilience. The farmers in the Scottish landscape picked on the word resilience, not from an ecological point of view, but more from a social and cultural point of view. And that was super exciting. People were in tears after the workshop that came up with that term. So it is possible to create these entities run by the people in the landscape. It puts 100% of the profit back into the landscape instead of the carbon project world, which sends half the profits out to Zurich or London or somewhere like that. And it has people working together for the long term. So maybe we can do that in other parts of the planet. We're seeing some examples of it elsewhere as well.
Mhm. That's really, really, really good. And Marjorie, on that vein, right? Like, so let's just say, you get a call tomorrow from a big company, and you were tasked with the opportunity to really reimagine corporate governance as it relates to this conversation. What might you do that's separate and apart from the traditional ESG that many companies would typically lean into as it relates to this topic? Like, how might we reimagine corporate governance to ensure that we're centering conversations on nature and really taking action?
Yeah. Well, I have to confess a bit of ignorance on my side in that, I haven't worked in this particular space in a while, so my ideas here may be out of date. But my impression is that right now we don't have these sort of superstructures that allow corporations, even ones that are very responsible, the ones that produce a report. They have good scores from MSCI. They're part of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Like they're doing all of the right things, but they're not able to really work at a systems level with all of the other industries. Like they may look at their operations or their value chain, but they're not looking at the other players. So could we get like corporate guilds where you get, car manufacturers working with the steel and cement factories that are building the highways and the bridges that the cars drive on, and the ones that are going to take care of the cars when they finally can't be driven anymore. And we're looking at the whole cycle. Can we get something where there's more corporate guilds that are offering end-to-end solutions for particular ecosystems with particular governments? I feel like that would start to change the tide, and we could get past some of the traditional ESG metrics, which are too narrow in scope to actually have macro level impact.
That's good. You're not that far removed, but go ahead, Alexis, and I'm gonna come to you, Jojo.
I'll be quick because I know Jojo has a comment. One of the things that has kind of done that, because it's so challenging to get out of in a boardroom, you're supposed to kind of be forward looking, and yet at the same time you don't know what the future is. In some ways, what people actually need to do is to pick futures and say those will be the future. Now we'll work towards it, we'll work backwards from them. And there's actually ways of doing this. Some people call it war games, some people call it scenario planning, some people call it futures planning, but to actually, I've seen it be very powerful, is when you say, okay, these are the worlds that will come, any one of them in any combination. So we work backwards from this and then say we have to set up a strategy that fits for those and then is resilient if something comes in out the side, So again, it would be, the energy transition is going to happen. I mean, the cost downs have gone in such a direction that it is no longer a question. The question is how fast. So if you take it as a given that that's going to happen, then you have to say, what value does my business bring in that future? And then the same thing of when, for example, we also have to pay for services that nature provides for free, or these sort of things in the future. And then say, work backwards from that of saying, what kind of business would I have then? And then which things can I put in place that I can still manage to run alongside my business right now, still maintaining profitability, still being able to run my business and not tank it next quarter. But you've got that direction that you're going towards and you stick to it. Now, one last thing is that's almost impossible to do. One, because CEO tenures are getting shorter. Two, board turnovers are going faster. And so all the people who would hold that to account, who would say, I'm going to give you some grace of, moving a little bit around this and actually championing this message to the outside market. In a bad example is kind of the way that actually Amazon was able to do for years, to say, we are going to be profitable, then stick with us, we'll be fine. And that kind of level of ability to stick to one direction and then also have the internal and advisory support and the CEO has the safety to do so, that's rare. Jojo, I know you wanted to say something. Let me just pass straight on over to you.
That is so good,
Sure.
though.
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting, actually. I mean, the thing that's emerging for me that sort of in a way ties all of these elements together, and it is actually about tying elements together in the sense that I think, our whole culture, the way that our global economic culture has grown up, has been on a compartmentalized, siloed mentality, which has emerged from hundreds of years of the Western canon of thinking. And it isn't, not everybody thinks like that. I mean, you brought up China earlier, that say 15 years ago might have been in a position of being in a really severe pollution and environmental issues, but has turned the ship around so fast that they're now, I mean, in our area, for example, of environmental legal cases, are light years ahead of the rest of the planet. So these and part of the reason for that is system shifts and longer, and think longer term. But then, sort of in a completely different space, we also see that in indigenous cultures where they think 7 generations into the future. And of course, and I'll slightly take issue with your thing about Alexis about it's about human survival. Of course it is about human survival, and of course the planet will do its own thing, but it will obviously lose certain things that we're doing. But the ingredient that I would bring in there is that those cultures really profoundly understand that we are part of that system. We are actually part of nature. We're not separate from nature, and actually we forget that at our peril. I mean, literally at our peril. We're the ones that, as you say, are going to have survival issues. And it really struck me from the project that Paul was talking about as well, that when we start joining dots and actually having these different elements, the environmental, the social, the cultural, the financial, all actually playing into each other, and having an awareness of that sort of that complexity and that, but with a sort of a healthy goal in mind, all of it's almost like a sort of an entrainment effect is created, and that's something that we're seeing very much in the area of our work, is that it's not about sort of necessarily setting a grand plan of how we're going to get the big polluters on board. It's about what is the right direction to go in. Here's in our case, here's a definition of ecocide that goes in that direction, and how do we sort of bring everybody with us, if you like, on this journey, that then sort of help them to join those dots. And I think it's interesting as well that I think, was it Marjorie, that you were bringing up this idea of having a sort of many different aspects, but sort of based on ecosystem or potentially place, so that actually there's the competition side of it becomes, it becomes much more of a collaboration in terms of, everybody moving forward to make sure that a certain place can survive or can be resilient. So yeah, so for me, I mean, the picture that I'm seeing is sort of importantly here in terms of a cultural point is that joining of dots is, how do we join those dots? And let's remember that, and this is something that's come up a couple of times in other people's comments as well, is that, nothing works without healthy ecosystems. I mean, I think we've all been saying that in different ways, but we just don't have a civilization unless we have healthy ecosystems that can provide for it. So in a sense, it's like that sort of gives us the earth is the boardroom aspect, if you like.
Absolutely. Well, this is really good. There was a question that popped in the chat, and please do continue to put your questions in the chat. We're monitoring them. We will bring them into the conversation. One of the questions talked about, what does this conversation means for future generations, right? And so, Marjorie, I'll come to you right now, but I do want the alums of the league to also chime in as we start to think about the notion of entrepreneurs, right? And how we show up in our organization as the ones who are really pushing and respectfully challenging status quo by any means necessary, and coming off on the other end with some great results for our company. How might we start to, as entrepreneurs, bring this conversation into our companies so that it does land in the boardroom and it starts to become a strategic mandate? So it's a non-negotiable if we start to push it forward. So Marjorie, I'll go to you first, and then followed by Paul and Alexis, really from an entrepreneur perspective.
Yeah, well, I'll just say I'll preface these comments by saying I'm one of the global catalysts for the League, and had the pleasure of co-authoring a book for the League with Maggie Maggie Dupree and Florencia Destrade. We wrote a book called The Intrapreneur's Guide to Pathfinding. And the book is really kind of written in the style of a survival guide, like you're out in some sort of trek in the wilderness. And it's around finding your path when there is no path. You have to actually find one. And that story really echoes the path of our species from moving out of, let's say, Africa and across the planet. And so I used to think, the problem that we had as a species was capitalism and colonialism. And then the more I looked at it, then I was like, no, I think it's maybe a problem of civilization when we moved from in the Neolithic Revolution into agriculture and hierarchies. And then the more I looked at it, I was like, no, actually, I think this is a species level issue. The species that we have the most in common with are not bonobos and chimpanzees. It's actually ants and termites. They're the only other species that dominate the planet and organize themselves in the way that we do. They have civilizations too. They even have agriculture, traffic rules, highly specialized occupations, and so on. And you see the same dynamics playing out in those species. And so what I think that the League can do, and this is really interesting. So Shamaya and I were part of a fellowship in England, I don't know, a year and some ago. And we went to visit a place that had a lot of history for England. And we were essentially learning about the history of enclosure when humans or the English were pushed off of the land into basically cities. And make a long story short, I think what we're seeing is that the roots of our problems are far older than the narrative is right now. That is just about capitalism. It really is around how we as species capture energy, use it with our technology and our huge numbers, and that's what's giving us these problems. And I think the entrepreneur's job is to be able to tell new stories that help us understand and to make what is invisible more visible, so that we're solving for the right problem. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That's great, Paul.
Wow, that's so sharp. I mean, ants. We are ants, and we're very good at just eating the planet. In the 1840s, George Stephenson put together engineering, finance, and real estate, and created, within 10 years, 10,000 kilometers of railway had been built across this planet in the 1840s. Now, and that allowed us as ants to eat the planet. We in the League have a sense that there's a way of reorganizing those pieces, the capital, the labor, the land, and the innovation, in a way that puts it all back together again. I don't think we're that far from it. And I've seen some examples where finance can drive this really rapidly. We worked with Michelin Tire Company, who were sourcing rubber from a plantation in Sumatra, right next to one of the 13 tiger landscapes on this planet. And if that little ribbon of rainforest had been cut, those tigers would have disappeared. They didn't want the reputational risk. We helped them design a landscape program with that national park, the restored forests and the rubber plantation. That became a $95 million sustainability bond, and they cashed out really well for Michelin. They ended up buying those rubber plantations because the risk had gone. How do we put those pieces together so profit, people, and purpose fuel each other? Rather than pull each other apart, which is how much of the business system works. It's possible to do this, and there's a number of other examples, but not enough. And that's what we in the League have to create, much more of this, and a standardized process to just push these out and make us all ants of restoration and reconstruction and healing of trauma underneath all of this.
Ants of Restoration. Oh my goodness. That's the next book that's coming out of the League. I can feel it. I love it. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm getting a bit wild with my metaphors here, but it's such a good group.
I was just about to say, in response to that, one of the things I found true about intrapreneurs wherever I've met them, and those in the League, is that there's just a certain level of doggedness that comes with people who have this type of behavior. And what it is like, I'm just going to go this way, I'll go that way. Okay, it doesn't work, we'll go this way. Keep trying until you just get at it. It's like a dog with a bone or something. And I think, one of the ways that I had used that had worked sometimes for people who just came into a business, people who were 50 years, and just stepping out, and we're on boards. One of the things that people often want is some meaning to their life. And they have to survive, they have to fit in somehow into the environment that they're in. But you often want it to mean more. And so, whereas my first arguments would always be sort of strategy based, I'd avoid as much as possible the kind of like the word sustainability, I would put it in terms of strategy and competition and all of these things. But by the end of the day, when I came to sort of a closing line, so to speak, I would usually wind up saying, this is one of those moments when people are going to look back in history and say it all happened right now. Like, how many people actually get to live through a point in time when your energy system completely flips over and where all the geopolitical questions are up in the air and where all of the big decisions are going to be made right now? So, I mean, isn't this pretty awesome? You get to be a hero in your day job. And then people would kind of walk out of there and be like, oh, wait, just being a civil engineer, every decision I make, if I just push a little harder in this direction or a little harder, like this will be something that will last, particularly in infrastructure, couldn't be more true, because anything you build is going to be around for at a minimum 30 years, probably more like 50. So I would be saying, like, well, if you're building something like that, you better be building it for right now, 2075, because that's when it's going to be, decommissioned. So if you can get to people in the beginning, you have to get in through the open door, which is the way that I'm already talking now with my colleagues. It's profit, it's competition, it's this sort of thing. But you can usually ensure the door stays open by the fact that people actually have some meaning. You don't call them to do something that is for the planet, is for something else. It's selfish. I want to be a hero in my day job, you know? And that also helps keep that doggedness going when the going gets tough, because it gets really tiring. So yeah.
I like to say we do things by any means necessary, right? We figure out how to get it done and we really just get it done. And that's one of the principles I embody each and every day. And I'm a proud alum of the league. And any opportunity that I get to talk to my colleagues or peers in different industries about this work and how they can really be a change maker from the seat that they sit in, it kind of shifts their minds and perspectives. And so final question for the group before we look into getting at some Q and A's. We started this conversation off about talking about what if, right? What if nature, the earth, had a seat in the boardroom? And after hearing many of the perspectives, we talked a little bit about legal, we talked a little bit about systemic changes, we talked a little bit about structural opportunities. What might be the one thing if someone was like, I want to get this done now, that they should do, or how might your mindset have shifted during this conversation? I know for me, I think I shared with the group as we were prepping for this call, I'm actually in the middle of a board meeting right now. So my board meeting for my company is going on over the next course of the next 2 days. And so I'm here having this conversation with you all. And you best believe tomorrow, when it's time for me to present, I will bring some elements into that conversation because this is just so timely. And so that is one of the biggest things I'm going to take away from us. Our time today is me being able to take some action and really hear and start to see some body language when I mention some of the things we discussed today. And so, Jojo, how about yourself?
Well, we're kind of a one-trick pony in the sense that we focus very specifically on the criminalization of ecocide. So of course, if there's like one thing, that's going to be the one thing that I'm going to be encouraging people to think about, talk about, bring up in their area. And I have to say, I'm so excited about this particular audience, this League of Intrapreneurs. And I hadn't heard of it until Danielle reached out to me, and I was so excited about it. And she'll tell you, like the first conversation we had, I was just like, wow, this is so cool that this thing exists. Because I just feel it's so important. What you were saying about how people in every possible sector can be change makers within that environment. I think one of the things that I suppose if I was going to say something beyond the obvious thing for me, which is about ecocide law, it's about people realizing how powerful they actually are. Because I think our sort of system in schooling tends to encourage us to position ourselves within certain hierarchies at certain positions and think that it's not okay for us to say certain things. But we're actually human beings are hugely powerful creatures, and as the ant analogy shows, when we organize ourselves, we achieve extraordinary things. So I think just being aware of how powerful we each are and what we can bring to a situation. And also as a final thought about sometimes people say to us, are you being realistic with what you're doing? And I'm like, well, actually, yes, because the reality that we live in is the reality created by the intentions of the people that came before us. So this is not about a sort of dichotomy between somehow realism and idealism. It's like, well, what is the reality that we want to live in? And this comes back to Alexis's point, let's behave as if that is the reality we want to live in.
That is so great. Paul, what's your thoughts?
Wow. Of course, landscapes. I'm a one-trick pony as well, but I think we all have a lot of power in the world. We all have decisions that we can make in our projects or in our spreadsheets or whatever. The challenge is always to go beyond thinking local, thinking about your particular system, and thinking landscape, thinking the region, thinking the system that you're sitting in. And it's not too hard to do exactly the same thing, but do it in a way that's connected with other people in your river valley, or other people in your supply chain, or other people in your part of the city, and solve a much bigger problem together than do it individually. And the benefits can be very good for your supply chain, for your business, for your organization. And you'll be seen as a leader in those processes. That's what's going to be rewarded in a world of turbulence and madness, and a world where sustainable finance is actually the growth area at the moment. So act local, but think global, and connect with other people in your landscape. And here's a good example of that. Someone I met in a cocoa company who realized that the world's cocoa supply will reduce by 40% in the next decade. And by looking carefully at this question, and we ended up in Cameroon, we developed a roadmap for deforestation-free cocoa and 3 landscape programs to secure cocoa supply from Cameroon. And most of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa. So it's possible. You can do these things. Back to you.
Thank you. Alexis, close us out.
I'll maybe offer a different perspective, because I fully agree with the ones that were put before. What is happening right now? What is changing? And at a pace that most people, it is an exponential pace. So those operating, especially in large companies right now, may not feel it as intensely until, quite frankly, it's too late. And so there's going to be so much change coming so quickly, and there's so much evidence that it already is, be it in energy systems, be it in materials, be it in how we value nature, that I would just say what's causing all of that is individuals who are just get obsessive about certain topics and simply don't pick one thing that you have to stick with your whole life. I mean, I thought I was going to be in large corporates my entire life. I got pretty geeked out about the energy transition and industrial decarbonization along the way. And now I'm leading business development in a scale up. You can pivot, you can do different things, but you need to get so obsessed about the idea of where it's going. And if there are young people on this call who are like, well, what career do I go into? I would say that I don't think half the companies that are around now will exist in the future because they're just not changing fast enough. And this is a particular moment in time when a lot of these technologies either are here and are just scaling, or they're just being invented right now. And I would just say if you have the freedom to do so, not everybody does, doesn't have university debt or whatever it is, but if you can somehow find enough flexibility to go after whatever you're obsessed with, then just keep at it because this world will change. You just develop what is your theory of change. You chase it because then you'll still have energy. It'll give you energy back to keep going. And then if your theory of change changes along the way, mine did. I used to think it was sustainability in large companies. Now I think it's actually just out competing them with new scale ups. When it changes along the way, then pivot to that. But just find the thing that you're obsessed with, because then you want to do it all the time, not in an unhealthy but unbalanced way, but in a way that's actually curiosity driven and excitement driven. And anybody who tells you you can't have a career like that, they're wrong, because all of us on this call have basically had careers like that didn't exist before, started companies that didn't exist before. So I guess that's my advice, is actually go get obsessed with a couple of things and maybe join a startup.
I love it. And with that, we will wrap. I couldn't agree with you more. My role didn't exist before they created it for me. And I am a strong believer of create your swim lane and stay in it. And it's okay to weave in and out of traffic, but once you figure out your niche, like just ride it up. And so we're excited that you all spent the last hour with us. And this session is being recorded and the video will be uploaded once the week wraps. We hope that you participate in the other sessions throughout the week. And thanks again for being a part of Global Entrepreneur Week 2025.